Speaker, are there other studies na nagsasabi na paano naghihikayat ng mga capital flows, investments?
I guess one thing, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, that we could do is we could also look at the current case study of Vietnam. We always look at Vietnam as another breakout economy where what has happened over the past years when they opened up the economy to the capital markets is they have about close to an improvement rate of 7.86% per year. The Philippines right now, our improvement rate is at 2.98%. If we juxtapose that percentage of improvement rate to the market cap, it wouldn't be very long that Vietnam may overtake the Philippines because of the high friction cost of transacting into our capital markets.
Mr. Speaker, siguro para maliwanag din, ano ba yung mga eksaktong inaasahan nating outcome sa panukala na ito?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, again, what we intend to do here is by lowering the transaction tax, more capital could come in to our market, into our free market. Retail Filipino investors will now be incentivized because of a lower tax rate. Foreign investors are now incentivized because there is a lower tax rate, and there is also what we have also in the Philippines is a strong consumer market that is consumption driven, wherein anybody who wishes to establish a business has now access to a capital market that has low friction cost to provide for the needs of the Filipinos. Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as a last manifestation, Mr. Speaker, this proposed measure puts forward tax cuts for a very small portion of financial players in the country. Now, guys, as improving efficiency in the Philippine capital market. Ang questionable po rito, wala namang clear and demonstrated na ugnay ang capital markets ng bansa sa productive sectors ng ating ekonomiya. Bukod sa napakaliit pa rin talaga ng domestic enterprises natin. In the proper time, we'll put on record our vote on this measure. Thank you. Maraming salamat, Mr. Speaker. Salamat, Ginoong Sponsor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, distinguished colleague.
Thank you, Congresswoman Brosas. Majority Leader, please.
Mr. Speaker, I move to recognize Representative Lawrence Defensor of the 3rd District of Iloilo.
Congressman Defensor, you're recognized. Please proceed, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will sponsor yield?
Mr. Speaker, happy to yield to a few questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. House Bill number 9227, in particular Section 15 thereof, appears to benefit the public interest, while a closer scrutiny thereof would reveal to whom does it benefit, where is the advantages, and to whom will the disadvantages go. As a sponsor of this bill, may I know if the gentleman is familiar with Republic Act 8799, otherwise known as the Securities Regulation Code?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, I am happy to be educated on the salient provisions of the said law.
I am happy to share with the sponsor and our colleagues the declaration of state policy under the Securities Regulation Code in relation to Section 15, or the new tax rate for the transfer of shares of stock. The declaration of state policy under Republic Act 8799 includes, among others, to encourage the widest participation of ownership in enterprise, enhance the democratization of wealth. It is similar to the objectives of this bill as provided in the committee report, which reads, to boost capital markets and investment competitiveness of the country. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Distinguished colleague.
Now, since this bill intends to boost investment competitiveness and the widest participation of ownership in enterprise by lowering the tax rate, am I correct to say that I heard the sponsor right that currently only 1% of investors in traded or issued stocks are retail investors? Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague.
That's right. And when we say that there is a very extremely low retail investor percentage in the market, may I know if the sponsor is familiar with Securities and Exchange Commission Circular Number 13, dated Series of 27, entitled Rules and Regulation on Minimum Public Ownership on Initial Public Offerings?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, I have a vague knowledge of this, and I am willing to be educated on the salient provisions of the said order.
Mr. Speaker, I would be happy to share the whereas clause of SEC Circular Number 13, Series of 2017. Whereas clause number 6, which reads also, whereas a higher public ownership increases market depth and is essential for sustaining continuous market for listed securities to provide liquidity, which in turn attracts good quality and long-term investments. May I know if the sponsor is familiar with the phrase public float?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, yes, I am quite familiar with the term public float.
Mr. Speaker, under the same SEC circular, public float is defined as public float of a company shall refer to the portion of the issued and outstanding shares that are freely available and tradable in the market, applicable to our current bill, and are non-strategic in nature, or those not meant for the purpose of gaining substantial influence on how the company is being managed. Since this bill, House Bill number 9227, involves reducing the tax rate for the sale, barter, or exchange of shares of stock listed and traded through the local exchange or through initial public offering. May I know, in plain and simple language, what does listed or traded mean? The sponsor can speak in the vernacular para mas maintindihan po ng pangkaraniwang Pilipino na gustong sumali sa pag-trade at pagbenta ng mga shares of stock sa ating local exchange.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague. Yun pong publicly traded company po, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, ay yung mga korporasyon or organization na nakapag-decide po sila na gamitin yung instrument ng stock market po natin para makapag-raise o makapagpundar ng capital po para sa kanilang negosyo. Ang ginagawa po nito ay, kunwari isang korporasyon, ay may mga shares o kaya bahagi na gusto nilang pamahagi sa publiko. Ino-offer po ito at a certain price At ito'y binibigyan ng justification ng kumpanya kung saan gagamitin kung sakaling ang public o si Juan de la Cruz or si Maria Santos wishes na bumili ng parang bahagi. Bahagi po kasi ito ng kumpanya na kanilang binibenta sa publiko. At kung si Juan de la Cruz or si Maria believes na sila ay naniniwala sa objective ng kumpanya nito, ay maaari nilang bilhin ang portion ng stock po na ito. In exchange po, yung perang binigay nila ay gagamitin ng korporasyon para sa intended maging expansion po ito sa operations, pagpapalago ng kanilang corporation. So yun po yung ibig sabihin ng public trading po.
Tama po, Mr. Speaker. And let me tie up the things we have been discussing. Kasi ang nais ng bill is to boost investment competitiveness and achieve the widest participation of public ownership. Kaya po, binababa natin ang tax rate ng transfer of shares of stock through an initial public offering or traded through the local exchange. Sa ngayon po, would the sponsor know kung ano ang average minimum public float ng mga publicly traded companies para malaman natin kung sino ba talaga ang makakabenepisyo nitong pagbaba ng tax rate sa pag-transfer ng shares of stock o pagbenta through an initial public offering?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, ang minimum public float po for a corporation po ay 20%.
That's
So kung
right.
bibigyan ko lang po ng halimbawa, distinguished colleague, ay kung ang isang korporasyon ay sabihin natin may 100 shares.
Yeah, I know. I get your point. What I'm trying to drive at is, if you look at the newspaper every day, under the business page, it's always on page B2 of the Star newspaper. Makikita mo lahat ng activity ng Philippine Stock Exchange and all the companies publicly listed and traded. Magbigay na lang po tayo ng halimbawa, katulad ng ICTSI. Nakaka-comply ba ang ICTSI, BDO, BPI, SM Prime, GT Capital, Metrobank ng minimum public float which is required under SEC Memorandum Circular Number 13, Series of 2017?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, based on our current information, these companies mentioned comply po with the minimum public float.
And the minimum public float is 20%.
That is correct.
Is it also correct to say na marami pa din pong ibang kumpanyang hindi nakakomply ng minimum public float? Meron pa po ba?
One-minute suspension, Mr. Speaker.
Session suspended.
Ray, 2 minutes. Linis ko lang para sa'yo.
Session resumed. Majority Leader?
Mr. Speaker, to the question of the distinguished colleagues, there have been recorded a few companies that who do not comply po with the minimum public float are suspended from public trading.
I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Speaker. In the billions of pesos traded every day in the Philippine Stock Exchange, our minimum public float is only 20%, and some have not yet complied. When we say that we want to reduce the tax rate for the sale or exchange of shares of stock through IPO or traded through the local stock exchange, to whom does the tax pertain? Who pays for the tax under the bill?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, the tax right now is to be borne by the seller.
The seller or the issuer?
Is
that-
issuer.
Yes. And am I correct to say that the issuer, in terms of initial public offerings, are multi-billion companies that have a capitalization in the billions of pesos? Is that correct?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, they normally wish to access the capital markets if they wish to marshal such large capitals. But no company is prohibited from using the stock market, even if it is not necessarily in the billions. Mr.
I
Speaker,
agree.
distinguished colleague.
But when you issue or become an issuer in an initial public offering, while you are required to pay or to pay 1%, 1/10 of 1%, you are also gaining billions of pesos in return for doing an IPO. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague.
What we're trying to drive at, Mr. Speaker, is that with a retail investment rate of just 1% and reducing the tax rate for a multi-billion company, hindi lang po nawawalan ng tax collection ang ating bansa, nakakabenepisyo pa ito sa mga kumpanya na sila ang nag-i-issue o sila ang seller ng multi-billion IPO or multi-billion sale of shares of stock in the Philippine Stock Exchange. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague.
Mr. Speaker, it appears that while the bill benefits public interest, if we look deeper, as I said earlier, it may enrich the already rich companies doing IPOs and benefit to a minimum the 1% retail investor who sell or trade their shares of stock in the stock exchange. May I know if the sponsor will consider reducing the tax rate for sale or exchange of shares of stock for retail investors and retain the existing 0.6% of 1% for IPOs done by multi-billion corporate.
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, for clarification po, when a company wishes to use the public offering to generate capital through an IPO, it is clarified that there is no longer an IPO tax on these companies that wish to initiate an initial public offering.
So this tax pertains now only to sale, exchange, or barter of shares of stock listed or traded through the local stock exchange, no longer IPOs.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
And for companies or for traders in the Philippine Stock Exchange, would you have data? Would you confirm the data that it's only 1% retail investors ang nagte-trade, sale, or barter sa stock exchange every day? So it's still a block sale for traders. Pag tinignan mo, most active, top gainers, top losers, hindi retail investors itong mga to. Is that correct?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, when we mentioned that it is 1%, we are talking of just 1% of the total population of Filipinos who transact in the local stock exchange. And this could include Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, if we will look at this, the current 2022 data shows that the retail, yung 1% po of all the investors in the stock exchange, 98% of that 1% are retail investors or individuals po. And then 1.88% ang institutional or corporate ang investors po sa stock exchange, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague.
I am with the sponsor in the objective of the bill that we want to boost investment competitiveness, like Vietnam, Taiwan, and Singapore. But I also want to see the declaration of state policy that we want the widest participation in ownership. I hope that reducing the tax rate for the sale, transfer, and exchange of shares of stock will have a corresponding effort on the part of the state to have its benefits trickle down to the retail investors and to improve or increase retail investment percentage in the Philippine Stock Exchange para hindi lang ang mga institutional investors at mga brokers ang makakagain nitong batas natin para sa kabutihan ng ating bansa. But truly, as provided under the Securities Regulation Code, we will have the widest participation of ownership and enhance the democratization of wealth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no more questions for the sponsor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, distinguished colleague.
Thank you. Majority Leader.